Okay, Erev Tov, everybody. Let's see here. Tov. I know that our class is Jewish history, and it does tangentially relate to Torah. So even though we're not learning psukim per se, and we will learn some Torah tonight as part of the class, because we're going to be learning about certain individuals and their Torah. So tonight I want to dedicate the learning to be for Zechut for Shlema for Eviatar Menachem ben Zahava. He's the husband of a woman I work with. He is in Matzav Kashe. He's in the ICU, and just davening that things should go well. Bezrat Hashem. Okay, I have been looking forward to this class for weeks for two reasons. Number one, this is the class that got interrupted with the sirens, and we went into our mamad at the time. The second reason is that it's a topic I love, and I'm really happy to be able to be teaching about it because it's a time period and personalities that some are known about, some aren't, and there's so many layers to each of these people. But what we're going to do is we're going to first take a look at just in general what I'm going to talk about. We won't get to everything tonight. There's not a chance. It helps if I do a screen share because my looking at it doesn't do you any good. So let me go there. Share. Okay. Okay, let me make this a little bigger. This is a chart of various individuals who lived from the 10th century to the 15th century. We're obviously not doing them all tonight. This is Ashkenazi Jewry, the top tier for a few centuries. Every single personality and or every single group, this is a group, the Balei Tosafot, which we'll talk about, has had back then till today, literally till right now, unbelievable impact on Judaism. Each one for different reasons, whether we're talking about Rashi or Rabbeinu Gershom, or we're talking about Maharam Merutenberg, all these people whom you're going to get to know a little bit more about. Now, again, if you want to just have a biography of these people, go ahead, look on Wikipedia, Shalom Yisrael. You'll get some biography, but the point here is not just the history of the individual, but we're going to now try to meld together some of the things we were doing before this, which had to do with the Crusades, and these individuals, and what is it that they have done that has had such a lasting effect on all of us till this day. Okay, I don't need it on screen share right now. I just want you to get the general idea of the different time period and people we're going to be speaking about. We're going to go through them one at a time. So I'm going to take it off the share screen right now. Okay. Make it, minimize it. Okay. The first person we're going to speak about is a man who's known as Rabbeinu Gershom, the mem at the end, who is also known as the Ma'or HaGolah. What is that? First of all, what does that mean? He was the Ma'or HaGolah. He was the enlightened, the diaspora. Who was he? What did he do? And some of the things he did and some of the enactments he made affect us literally till this very minute. I'm going to give you just a little snippet of something he did. There are three things. I'm going to tell you one of them right now. We'll come to the other two. And then we're going to backtrack a little bit to understand a little bit more about him and how he played such a tremendous role in the birth of Ashkenazi Jewry. Now, let's keep in mind, until a couple classes ago, we dealt with the golden age of Spain. And we finished up in about the 14th century, approximately, 13th, 14th century. And now we're backtracking. We're going all the way back to the 10th/11th centuries. The reason that's important to understand the timeline is that now we're going back to the end of the time of the Gaonim. Talked about them quite a while back. And this man, the Rabbeinu Gershom, was the student of Rav Hai Gaon, the last of the Gaonim. So now we start to see the bridge of the Gaonic period, which was mostly Babylonia, and the scene is now shifting in a physical, literal sense to Europe, mostly France and Germany. We talked about the fact that by the time of Hai Gaon that the yeshivot were starting to shut down and people were leaving, getting smaller and smaller, as it has been in Jewish history all along. Wherever there is a a center of Torah that starts to get smaller, it sprouts up somewhere else. That's the nature of Judaism. Hopefully we've seen a tremendous growth of Torah in Israel, and hopefully as the Jewish communities get smaller and smaller in the United States due to all of them making aliyah, he says tongue in cheek, and the yeshivot close, we'll get even more so here. So in any case, I'm going to mention one of the three famous enactments or gzerot he made that that is still in effect to this day. And we'll talk a little bit more about him, and then we'll talk about his other enactments. He made a decree that for 1,000 years, and we're past that point already, for 1,000 years, a man in the Ashkenazi world, this was not accepted in the Sephardi world, may not be married to two women. Polygamy. According to the Torah, a man can have 2 wives, 3 wives, 5 wives. It's perfectly halachically acceptable. There are still communities around the world, very few in the Sephardi world, where there have been and still are some men who have multiple wives. Not sure why. But in the Ashkenazi world, the edict, the enactment of Rabbeinu Gershom was that even though it's permissible based on Torah law, he made a decree that one man may not marry more than one wife. He said it was originally to expire this decree about 700 years ago. Sorry, not 700. What am I talking about? Yeah, about 700 years ago, 600 years ago, and it was accepted by that point by Ashkenazi Jewry as that's the halacha. So therefore, even though you may live in a country where it's illegal, which in Israel polygamy is illegal, even if you live in a country that it's legal, halachically an Ashkenazi man may not have more than one wife. Well, wait a minute. We actually do have some cases that they do have more than one wife. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. But let's first, before we get to the other two main things he gave us, I want to talk about a little bit more background. His title, Me'or HaGolah. Over the centuries, there have been different titles given to great rabbis of our history. Probably the most widely used and unknown, it's widely used and not understood, is calling someone who lives in the diaspora the Rosh Bahag. I didn't even bother putting it on the screen. I'll explain. Rosh Bahag is the Rashi Tevot, or the abbreviation for Rosh Kol Bnei Hagolah. Rosh Bahag, which means the head of the entire diaspora. It's not an official title like we saw the Exarch. It's not like that. It's not like the Resh Galuta, which we talked about in Bavel and Babylonia. It's a title of admiration. He's like so good. He's like the head of all the diaspora Jewry. It's called the Rosh Bahag. We've had the title of Gaon, which normal Hebrew means genius. And we talked about the Gaonic period. That was the title that they had. So there's been different titles. His title, Me'or HaGolah, as far as I know, he's the only one that ever was given that title. And the first person to call him that was Rashi, who comes a couple of generations, well, actually, the next generation after him, which we'll talk about. It was the one who enlightened the entire diaspora. Now, if you think about it, it's an interesting use of a phrase. What do you mean enlighten them? So he could say enlighten them with Torah, which makes the most sense. Why? It says, Kiner mitzvah v'Torah or, that mitzvah is a candle, and Torah represents light. That's a simple shot, simple explanation of the title. But it's even more than that. What is the time period that he's living? Okay, he's living in the time period that's around the end of the Gaonic period, the time where it would seem that the level of Torah of learning is going down, and he brings the Torah, he enlightens the Torah, but it's also because it's leading into the time period. Remember, in 1096, we have the beginning of the Crusaders. So he's coming into a very dark time period of history, and therefore this title is given to him. He was considered the first leading Ashkenazi rabbi. Eventually, we'll probably do something on Ashkenazi Sephardi stuff, but right now, he is like the beginning of the line of Ashkenazi Judaism, Ashkenazi rabbis. I read an article years ago. I haven't been able to find it. Maybe our resident journalist, Abby, if you know where it might be found, that supposedly discovered that all Ashkenazi Jewry sprouted from 300 families, if I remember right. I don't remember. I've read it multiple times. I don't remember the source for it. So if you can find it, I'll try and find it also. But that's about that's a population. That's a demographic issue. Right now, we're just talking about the rabbinic world and what they brought to us. So, as the seat of center of Jewish Torah, Jewish thought, halacha starts to migrate, it migrates from Bavel to France and Germany. Why there? It's beyond the scope of tonight. It's not important right now for what we want to talk about. But that's who he was. He's like the first big, what we would call today, by the way, the word is really Gidol Hador, not Gadol Hador, it's Gidol Hador. But we all say Gadol Hador anyways. The second limitation he gave, or the edict, was that a man may not divorce his wife against her will. She has to agree to accept the get. There was evidently, I know this is shocking, there was a time period in his time where men were abusing their wives with halacha, and they were just divorcing them. And I know it's shocking that a Jewish man wouldn't treat his wife properly. He says, tongue embedded in cheek. But what was I won't say big deal. What was the difference then versus today? A woman who's divorced today, gets divorced against her will today, is in a totally different situation than over 1,000 years ago. By the way, even a different situation than about 250 years ago. Women didn't have any power. They had no land. They didn't generally have own a business. They didn't have their own income. Life was controlled by their husband. And I'm not talking the Jewish world only. This is the way it was in the world in general. So if a man were to divorce his wife against her will, yes, there was a ketubah, but that was it. That's all she had, right? That was the payout if she could be lucky enough to get that. So he enacted the idea to protect women from abusive husbands, and I'm talking about right now more of a financially abusive way. There is an exception, and this is what I'm going to say, how sometimes a man might be married to more than one woman. There's an exception about which is a very, very misunderstood and sadly abused heter, or permission, which is something called the heter mea rabbanim. It literally means the permission of 100 rabbis. And it's a dispensation where in certain situations, I'll give you an example, that a woman who will not accept a divorce from her husband, thank you, Abby sent to the chat. Thank you, the link. I'll make sure I put it into the group. That 100 rabbis say that it's permissible for him to remarry in a certain situation. Let's say, for example, she committed adultery. She's refusing to accept the get. And especially if he's a Kohen, they're not allowed to stay married. And I don't care. And so in that kind of situation, there's this idea of a heter mea rabbanim that would permit this person to get married. They're not getting married. They're actually getting a second wife. It's not a divorce. So that's one. Another case, we actually have a situation with no names in our neighborhood many years ago before we made Aliyah, where a woman was, I don't know if it was because of an illness or a car accident. I don't remember, but it was many, many years ago, that his wife was basically, I don't know if they were newlyweds or early on in their marriage. And that was it. I don't know if she's still alive or not, but for years she was incapacitated, not with it at all. And through a heter mea rabbanim, he was able to marry. And it's not remarrying. He's marrying, basically has a second wife. We actually have a friend that went through a similar situation. In any case, this has been, unfortunately, so this is an exception to divorcing a woman, quote unquote, against her will. Unfortunately, this has been severely abused in the last many years by men who will refuse to give their wife a get, but because there's an old boys club of rabbis who want to help out the guy, they'll give him a heter to marry another wife. There's a famous case in California. Guy's last name is Kin, K-I-N. And it's a mitzvah to publicize when you talk about a guy who's a Russia like that. And I wrote an article about him a few years ago called More Than Kin and Less Than Kind. If you know a little bit about Shakespeare, you'll understand the reference. And it was about his community, how they were embracing him, and he got a heter mea rabbanim, and he wouldn't give his wife a get. So he has another wife. Anyways, so that's the second thing. The first decree was you can't marry more than one wife. Second one was that you can't divorce a woman against her will. And the third one is the lesser known one, but it is absolutely still in effect. By the way, all these edicts still, even though it's over 1,000 years, still hold. And the last one is his edict was you're not allowed to read somebody's mail. Now, in those days, what happened? You didn't just there was no mailbox or Pony Express. You had your what you wrote. It was folded into whatever way you folded it, and it was sealed with wax or whatever it was, and was sent off. You were not allowed to read someone's sealed mail. It's a concept of gossip. It's injunction of lo telech rachil bi'amecha. He felt that it was almost a level of a Torah mandate that you should not be allowed to do that. How does that affect us to this day? Okay, you're sitting on a bus, you're sitting on an airplane, you're waiting you're sitting at a wedding, you're sitting next to somebody, they got their phone, they're checking their messages. Yeah, what's he talking? What's he getting there? That's asur according to Rabbeinu Gershom. To this day, you're not allowed to look at somebody else's phone or just to stop and pick it up. If I don't have permission to pick up your phone and look at it and look at your email, look at your messages, forget it. It's asur. It's no different than what Rabbeinu Gershom said, that you're not allowed to read somebody's mail. There was a custom. I only found this one place. I haven't found the whole background to it. That they would write on the envelope, which I don't know if it's called an envelope, but an envelope, when they would send a letter, they would write an acronym of a pasuk. The pasuk said, I have it here in my notes, Chofer gumatz bo yipo, the one who digs a trench will fall into it. Uporetz geder yishachenu nachash, one who breaks down a fence, a snake will bite him. That's the famous pasuk that has to do with it's from Kohelet, that it says one who breaks a fence. But what kind of fence? A ban. When there's a ban against something, when you do that, when you go against it, a snake should bite you. So they would take this initial letters of that pasuk and put that on the outside of an envelope as a warning to people not to open the mail. He also did one other thing, which was, again, very, very much timely, and it was very much influenced by what was going on around him. We know that not just during the Crusades, but even before that, Jews in some cases were forcibly converted. They were forcibly converted, and they became Christian. And the question is, what is their halachic status? I'm not going to get into the whole question, are you allowed to convert, quote unquote, even though in your heart you don't feel it and you're doing it to save your life? There's all kinds of questions about that. I'm not going to get to that. There are shelot and chuvot. There's responsa about that. But one of the things that he enacted was that if a Jew converted to Christianity and then did tshuva, repented, he would be welcomed back into the community. It's not the party line necessarily by across the board, but that was his enactment. That was his statement, his opinion. But that's who he was. You have to think about, I'm just pulling out these three little things, these three enactments. But if you ever heard the expression cherem de Rabbeinu Gershom, cherem de Rabbeinu Gershom is this. These are the cherem. The cherem is a ban, which is actually why if you know that, like you talk about a sultan, a king has a harem. Why is it called a harem? Because it's haram. Haram meant a ban, that no other guy can touch these women because they're the sultans, they're the kings. Cherem de Rabbeinu Gershom is one of the legacies he left us with, but that's really a footnote. Even though it has effect till this day, it's a footnote. Why? Because who really was he? He was the rabbi who was the rabbi of the rabbis and the rabbi of the rabbis. What's this chain? Whether it's going to be Rashi or it's going to be his grandson Rashbam, or all these names you're going to hear between tonight and probably next week, Rabbeinu Tam, they became who they became only because of the Rabbeinu Gershom or Hagula. He was the one who planted the seed of Ashkenazi Jewry as far as Torah, as far as a Masorah. Next person is in the 11th century, meaning in the 1000s. Question was given, even the male of a husband or a minor child? A minor, no, because you have an obligation to make sure your kids stay safe. A parent is allowed to, halachically and legally, allowed to check their child's phone and email if they believe, not if they believe, they want to kind of keep an eye on them. A spouse is no different. You cannot look at your spouse's emails or messages without their permission. You need to have okay, because it's private as well. Doesn't mean that they're going to keep secrets. Doesn't mean that. but you have to respect that same boundary. If you say, look, I don't care, here's my phone. I tell my wife, here's my phone, open at any time. I don't care, read anything you want. I've already instructed family that after 120 years, my computer, it gets destroyed because there are things that communication and things between people that I have to deal with. You don't need that, doesn't need to be out there. This gets destroyed. You just throw it in the grave. I don't know. In any case, but yes, for a child, for a minor, yes, you have an obligation, and slash it's okay, but not for your spouse. The next person is not well known at all, but the reason I'm mentioning him, we're going to talk about it for about 2 minutes, is what he wrote. He wrote something called the Aruch. His name is Rabbi Natan, and he lived in Rome. Remember, at this time period, the people don't have last names, like Rabbi Natan Kowalski. They didn't have last names yet. In most of the world, it's mostly in Europe when last name starts coming into being used, and they grow. It's interesting names over centuries. You have what's called in Russia something called the patronymic name. You have in Mexico, the person's name has to do with a combination, their family name, their mother's family name, their father's family. It's all kinds of interesting stuff. But at this point, there's really not yet. It's about the time period where people are starting to get it, the Middle Ages. Rabbi Natan of Rome wrote a book called the Aruch. I have a picture of it, but it's pointless for me to put it on the screen. I'll just tell you about it. What is the Aruch? If you remember our previous classes, we talked about the Talmud, and that the Talmud finishes approximately the year 500, i.e. middle 500, approximately in the middle of the 6th century. We are now 4 centuries later. The Talmud has gone through learning for centuries through the times of the Gaonim, the Savoraim immediately after, then there's the Gaonim, and now we're at this point in history. It was written in Aramaic, in Aramite. The people in Bavel, who were studying the Gemara for centuries in Bavel, where for the most part it was grown, spoke Aramaic. They spoke Hebrew to the degree they spoke Aramaic. That was their language. Hence the reason it's more or less written in Aramaic. Mishnah is written in Hebrew, remember that, because that's written in Israel. And now they're in Germany. They're in France. They needed the art scroll, so to speak. They needed they need to understand the words. They didn't know the words. So Rabbi Natan of Rome basically opened the door by writing a book called the Aruch, which is a dictionary. It's a dictionary that is used to this very day. I think I have a copy. I'm not sure. I think I do. But you can go online. You can just type in Aruch, Ayin Resh Vav Chaf, Sofit, like Shulchan Aruch. And you'll find tens of thousands of words that are translated into Hebrew and sometimes Old French and other languages. It's Italian, but depending on the citation. But what he did, therefore, was to give the ability for people to understand not only the Gemara, but to understand what was really happening in the different discussions and everything else. Rashi and the Balei Tosafot, who right now, if you don't know what that means, it's fine. They're coming up the next generation, quote the Aruch extensively. They come across a word in the Gemara, and it says XYZ, and said, what does that mean? So Rashi will give an explanation, and sometimes he'll say, importantly, like the editors put in parentheses, Aruch, which means that's where it's from. The explanation comes from his book. So he really was able not only to help translate and make it more available. It wasn't a linear translation like Art Scroll. It was a dictionary, a Gemara dictionary, it also gave insights into topics. If you fast forward to, I think it's the late 19th century, I don't remember exactly, a man named Marcus Jastrow. Anyone, let's say my generation, who learned Gemara in high school, you had to get the Jastrow dictionary. The Jastrow dictionary, where he would take, I think he has less entries than the Aruch, I'm not sure, would take words of the Gemara and phrases and explain them, but he didn't just explain them. It's in English, but he also gave the etymology of the word. He gave a couple examples where it shows up. I mean, nowadays it's like click on a button, you get your answer. But what he did was groundbreaking. I remember when I learned in Shalavim, my Gemara skills were decent, I guess, when I got there. They were much better after. But brought with a jastro. I haven't opened my jastro. Probably the binding would crack if I opened it. I got it from my bar mitzvah. I used it extensively, but not anymore. Not because I know every word, but because there's a lot of other things. But in any case, the Aruch remains very, very popular still today in the yeshivish world, so to speak, and among people who are not in the yeshivish type of world. Okay. Now we get to the star of the show, Rashi. Probably one of the most well-known and least understood or least known person. I know that's a contradiction. We're going to see why. I'm going to start off by giving you a mind-blowing kind of statement. I know some of you already know this, but it's worth to hear it because I like it. I like especially telling this to kids who are trying to learn Rashi script. For those of you who are not aware, the Rashi in many printings of Chumash and Gemara, of course, is written in a different font. It's called Rashi script. And very often, when kids learn it, they will ask, why did Rashi write in this script? Mind-blowing statement is he not only did not write in that script, he never even saw it. It wasn't even around for about 400 years after he died. And the kids go like, what? So why is it Rashi script? Where'd it come from? So keep in mind, we're still at a time period of history where there is no printing press. We're hundreds of years away from printing press, which when we come to this man, Maram Rutenberg, which we won't get to probably tonight, and we see the fact that there were all these copies of the Talmud that were burned, and 24 cartloads, which we talked about a while back, and you're talking about tens of thousands of pages handwritten, okay? So in any case, when the first Humashim are being printed, because by then already idea of learning Chumash with Rashi was already ingrained in all Klal Yisrael. They would print a Chumash. They had the Torah part here, and below it or on the side would be the words of Rashi. But how do they distinguish between which was the Torah and which was the Rashi? So the printer came up with a font called Rashi script or Ktav Rashi, and that's where it was born. It had nothing to do with Rashi. He never saw, and it's not like he wouldn't figure it out in a millisecond. It's pretty straightforward. Many of the letters are the same as in regular Hebrew letters. Some are significantly different. And there's a little nuance in some of the letters, like the Vav and the Zayin, whatever. But Rashi never saw it. Rashi never wrote it. Okay, so who was he? Why we call him Rashi? His name was Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki. His father's name was Yitzchak. So it's Resh Shin Yud. So it stands for a couple things. Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, which is the most common explanation. There's another one, and that is because, as we will see, he opened the door to every Jew to be able to learn Chumash and Gemara too, but especially Chumash. It stands for Rabban Shel Yisrael, the rabbi of all of Israel. He gave us the key to open the Chumash. Interestingly enough, and this is not about Rashi now, this is about Onkelos, who wrote a commentary translation on Chumash, who was a ger, who was a convert. So you have Chumash, Rashi, and usually Onkelos, which we'll talk about him another time. This week's parsha, Parshat Noach. At the beginning of the parsha, it says, "Vatimalei haaretz chamas." The world was filled with theft. Onkelos says, "Vatimalei haaretz chamas." The world was filled with chatufim. So he translates Hamas as chatufim, which means the kidnapped victims, those who have been, If you don't believe me, just take a look. Right at the beginning of this week's parasha. First time someone told us months ago, when I was going over this week's parasha, I came across it, of course, yesterday, day before. No, first day, on Sunday. And it's like, whoa, forgot about that. So the chatufim, that's what's the translation for Hamas. Anyways, machshim. Anyways, so he is the teacher of all of Israel, not just the rabbi, but the teacher. Rabbi means teacher. So he became the teacher of all of the Jewish people. There are only two other people that were given that title of the word Rabbeinu. One is Moshe Rabbeinu, because he is the quintessential teacher, because he taught us everything, not just Torah, but how to be a Jew. And the other one is Rabbeinu HaKadosh. We talked about him when we were talking about the Mishnah. Rabbi Yudah Nasi was also known as Rabbeinu HaKadosh. Why was he given the title Rabbeinu? He opened the door to bringing Torah Shebe'al Peh, the oral law, into writing to be, again, available to the masses. So Moshe Rabbeinu, Rabbeinu HaKadosh, and Rabban Shal Yisrael, Rashi, are not just amazing, critical figures in Jewish history. Each one is a new nexus to Torah and Jewish history. There's no other person like Rashi in the last 2,000 years who had such a major role in making Torah wisdom accessible to so many Jews, even Art Scroll. And I don't mean that as a joke. Art Scroll has done amazing things. I'm very much an anti-Art Scroll person for certain hashkafic philosophical reasons. But the first time I ever came across was in 1976 for Shavuot. I was a senior in high school. And at that time, it was customary. My father, started something at Camp Mosheva in Wisconsin, that the seniors would go up to Camp Mosheva for Shavuot, learning and everything else, of course, and then go back to Chicago. And when I was there was a man, Rabbi Moshe Kushner, Zichrono Livracha, who took out a book to explain the book of Ruth. Ruth, it's in English, and explain these things, like all these different conversations. Like, I got to get me one of those. The first book they published was actually Megillat Esther. And it was it was called Art Scroll because the way they did it, they had this all the artwork, and it was originally a scroll because of Megillat Esther. The name stuck, obviously. And the second book they came out with was Ruth. And that's the one that had just come out, like just before Shavuot. And that's where Art Scroll was born, 1975, 1976. And they have made accessible to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Jews and non-Jews, by the way, Gemara and Torah in an unbelievable way. Putting aside their bent when it comes to history and other things, when it comes to various other issues that I have with them, but no one could take that away from them. They've done unbelievable things, but still it doesn't come to the toenail of Rashi. It doesn't even come to his toenail. There are some legends about Rashi. I'll mention a couple of them. Probably one of the most famous ones has to do with his mother. His mother was pregnant with Rashi. Obviously, he wasn't Rashi when he was born. That his parents didn't name him Rashi. The parents didn't name the Chavetz Chaim. The Balamor wasn't called the Balamor. He was born. They became these people. These people known by the name of their book or their writing. In any case, she was pregnant with who would literally Shloimeh, and she was walking down a very narrow street in the Jewish quarter, and a nobleman's carriage came passing through, and it's such a high rate of speed that had she not moved out of the way, she would have been trampled. But there was nowhere to move, and supposedly she turned for her stomach to be facing the wall, and miraculously the wall moved in, or her body contracted, and it made an indentation for her, and she was saved. Okay, I don't know. It's a very nice story. Whether it happened, doesn't make a difference. It would make sense to be something like that. Okay, I'll tell you a couple other stories in a minute. We'll get to, but I want to show you or tell you two things about him that many people don't know. It has to do with his humility, and it has to do with his kibud avim. You would think that a person as great as Rashi would be like, I'm pretty hot stuff, like filled with himself. But no, look, Moshe Rabbeinu was not. Was the Anav B'Kol Adam. He knew who he was. He was still a human being. Rabbeinu HaKadosh also, same thing. And same thing is true with Rabban Shal Yisrael, i.e. Rashi. He's very humble, had humble beginnings. When he started as a young man, he was reading Chumash, and he had ideas, and he decided to write them down. And he took a notebook. There's an old Hebrew word for notebook, which is kuntres. Not even Hebrew. I think it comes originally from Greek, if I'm not mistaken. Kuntres. And he would take these kuntresim, these notebooks, he'd write his commentary, he'd leave them with no name, and he'd leave them on his teacher's desk anonymously. The teacher would read it. It's like whoever's writing this is a genius. And he would do this, I don't know the amount of time over which, till he came public saying it was him. But eventually they were put combined and compiled. For the most part, Rashi does not give original ideas. His brilliance is he takes information and puts it in the right place. He'll say, here's a pasuk. Okay, the Gemara in Bava Kama says X, Y, and Z. Now I understand this pasuk. Very little time does he say something just completely randomly brand new. He does, of course. It's called chidushim. I'm talking about Chumash right now. So what happens is, after this time period, he's young and he's writing in these notebooks, people didn't know who he was. So they started talking about this man, or whoever it was, as Kuntres, the notebook guy. And the name stuck. Because if you look in Tosafot, which are the emendations to the Gemara, you'll very often see Hiresh HaKuntres. When they're about to explain their own opinion about something, this is Rashi's grandchildren's time period. When they want to disagree with Rashi, very often the introductory words are Piresh HaKuntres or Piresh Bikuntres. Rashi explained blah, 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 blah. And then they go on their derech and say what they want to say. He's called Kuntres all over the place. Question is like, why? There's some guy who's learning Gemara, or some woman who's learning Gemara, who picks up the Gemara, and they look in the Tosfot, they say, who's this Kuntres? Right? It's Rashi. Why is he called that? Because again, he wrote his original commentary on Torah in little notebooks and left them anonymously. So that's one level of his genius and his piety. There's something else I want to show you. This one I only heard maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And I said to the person who told it to me, why am I in my 60s when I heard this? I should have heard this in first grade. No, that's an exaggeration. Third grade, I should have heard this. Now, some of you may have heard this before, but I don't know. Yep. Okay. Last week's parasha, Bereshit. Most people who've learned Chumash in their life have heard the very famous question that Rashi starts the entire Chumash. Let's go through it. Rabbi Yitzchak said, Lo hayat tzarich lahatchil et haTorah, ela me'achodesh hazeh lachem. The Torah could have started in Parashat Bo, it's my bar mitzvah parasha, in the chapter 12 in book of Shemot, and she could have started with Achodesh hazeh lachem rosh chodashim. The concept of sanctifying the new moon. Why? Why could it start there? Shehi mitzvah rishona shenitztavu ba'Yisrael. It's the first mitzvah that the Torah gives to the Jewish people. Torah is not a history book, so it's meant for halacha, for Jews to know how to live. So Rashi says, why don't they just start in Perek Yud Bet in Shemot? Umatam patach b'Breshit. So why they start with Breshit? Then he gives a whole long answer. Fine. You'll notice something. He quotes Rebbe Yitzchak. There's a commentary. Rashi is so well learned, they're what called super commentaries. Super doesn't mean they're good. Excellent. It means they're on top of. One of the more famous ones, something called the Mizrahi. The Mizrahi writes a commentary on Rashi, because sometimes Rashi is not completely understandable what he's trying to say. There's a modern book that came out years ago called What's Bothering Rashi? But so there's a commentary known as the Siftei Chachamim. No biography on him. He wrote a commentary on Rashi. So he writes about this particular Rashi. He says, I'm a Rabbi Yitzchak. The first words that Rashi uses, I'm a Farshim Makshim. The commentaries are like in a quandary. If you look at the Gemara, there is a Rabbi Yitzchak. Many times there's Rabbi Yitzchak. But there's nowhere in the Gemara or in the Midrash that Rabbi Yitzchak says this question. Remember, this isn't Rashi saying it. It's Rashi quoting Rabbi Yitzchak. Elamash amar matam patach betulo. Elashazeh Rabbi Yitzchak haya aviv shel Rashi. Who's the Rabbi Yitzchak? He's quoting his father. Remember, his name is Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki. He is the son of Yitzchak. He starts the entire commentary on Torah with Kibud Av Ve'em. V'lo haya kol kach gadol b'Torah. He wasn't the greatest gadol in Torah. Uvno Rashi and his son Rashi, Ratzah lechabdo. His son wanted to honor him. Ulahazkiro b'tchilat chiburo. And he wanted to mention his name at the very beginning of his writings. V'sha'al mi'aviv l'hakshot eze kushya lichtov mishmo. He says, ask me a question. and I'm going to write it in your name. This is unbelievable, mind-blowing stuff. Where Rashi, this is like one of the beauties of Rashi, that there's so much embedded, so much hidden in there, which is why there are super commentaries on Rashi. I know someone who wrote a nice sefer on the Rashi and the gematrias of all the different the Dibur HaMatchil, the opening words. So all kinds of amazing things out there at Rashi. But there's more, as they say. But wait, there's more. One of the other beauties of Rashi is that his ability to be very succinct. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But I want to go back a little bit more to what we talked about a couple classes ago. Remember, we were talking about the Crusaders. And I said we're going to see how that affected the generation of the Crusaders. There's a generation, multiple generations. This happened. The Crusaders embark on their conquest of the Holy Land. Remember, Godfrey de Bouillon in 1095/1096. And Rashi himself witnesses some of the horrific things of the Crusaders. He writes a piyut about it that's used during the Amin Noraim. But interestingly enough, when the Crusaders are about to go on their first crusade, that Godfrey de Bouillon sends them on, Godfrey de Bouillon already knows of Rashi. Rashi's in France. And Godfrey de Bouillon, by his name, like you spell like bouillon cube, but bouillon, he already heard about Rashi's greatness. And this crazy thing is he goes to Rashi himself and he asks him, will my crusade be successful? And Rashi had to tell him the truth. He tells him, you are going to go, you're going to conquer Jerusalem, and you're going to rule over it for a very short period of time. Eventually, you're going to return to France, the city of Troyes, T-R-O-I-S, and you're going to come back with only 3 horsemen. That's the way it is. And Godfrey de Bouillon told him, if I come back with 4 riders or more, I'm going to kill all the Jews of France. Okay, it's on Rashi's head now. And eventually, events happen exactly as Rashi had told him. He gets to Eretz Yisrael, gets to the Holy Land. He conquers Jerusalem in the First Crusade. It's ruled very briefly by him, by Godfrey de Bouillon and his people. He's driven out of the land of Israel. He comes back to France. And at the gate of the city where Rashi is in Troyes, he realizes as he's about to enter, he has 4 horsemen, 4 horses, 4 horsemen. And he's out for blood. He's going to destroy the Jewish community, as he told Rashi. As he's about to enter the city, and he comes through this massive archway, a giant stone falls and kills one of the horsemen. Now he returns with 3. He goes to the Jewish quarter to tell Rashi, just to find out Rashi had just died. Now, the fact that Rashi just died is going to come into play with something else. I mentioned to you he was very succinct. He was very careful with his words. So if you want to know more about that, you're going to join me next week in class, Bezrat Hashem, with a slight change next week. We have a Sheva Brachot next week, and I don't want to miss class. And for those of you who can be here just a half hour earlier, I'm going to start 6:30, just one time, 6:30 to 7:15. I'll send it in the group chat, of course. But we'll find out more about Rashi. In fact, he's very succinct and what happened after he passed away. A couple more stories about him. But he's a character that obviously we could spend weeks just talking about him. We're not going to, because after a while it'll get boring. But some of these nuggets are just incredible, and which is why I was looking forward to this particular class tonight. So in the meantime, please, if you have a moment to daven for Eviatar Menachem ben Zahava, should have refuah shlema, and all the ptsuim, all those who've been injured. I'll send the name on the chat. I'll also send the link that Abby sent me about the history, about the beginning of Ashkenazi Jewry. And thank you all very much. Have a great evening, and we should have B'sorot Tovot.
Thank you very much.